6 people have been arrested at a Greenpeace demonstration outside Vancouver Harbor. They've been charged with mischief. The protesters had surrounded an American aircraft carrier capable of carrying nuclear weapons. They began painting the international radiation symbol on the ship, then climbing it. That's when the American crew reacted by spraying water hoses. Greenpeace said today's protest won't be its last. The USS Independence is scheduled to remain in Vancouver's English Bay until Sunday.
Good evening. Greenpeace was out in force today, and once again the environmental group was battling an old enemy, the U.S. Navy. As usual, it was an unequal battle as a flotilla of inflatable Zodiacs took on a massive aircraft carrier. But despite that and the failure of numerous other protests to stop American warships visiting Vancouver, it was clear that Greenpeace is not about to give up. Paul Heaney reports.
With the sun streaking through a gunmetal gray sky, Greenpeace headed out to sea. Its target, the USS Independence, a Forester-class aircraft carrier with a crew of 3,000. Greenpeace claims the Independence carries nuclear weapons. The U.S. Navy will neither confirm nor deny this.
I'll tell you why we're here. Look at this thing. This is one of those evil things that's ever been invented.
As the Independence slows to anchor in English Bay, Greenpeace launches its first salvo. The Navy fights fire with water. A Vancouver police boat moves in and arrests the protester. Minutes later, a second protester chains himself to the carrier's stern. While this is going on, another Greenpeace crew spray paints the port gunnel. This draws the wrath of many sailors, some of whom will undoubtedly be assigned to scrape off the paint. The 4 aboard the Greenpeace Zodiac are arrested.
Canada is officially a nuclear weapons-free country.
The man chained to the stern is cut down by a Ports Canada crew who just happened to have a pair of bolt cutters. In all, 6 people are arrested and charged with mischief. Greenpeace spokesman Simon Waters says it was worth it.
This ship is an absolutely disgusting monstrosity. We came here to show our opposition. We're prepared to do this, and we want the people of Vancouver to do whatever they feel appropriate to stop these ships. People don't want them here. Let's look at this bloody thing. It has 100 nuclear weapons on board. Each of those nuclear weapons is 100 times more powerful than the bomb that we dropped on Nagasaki 44 years ago today.
The protest now over, Greenpeace makes a final circle around the Independence. The ship's crew responds with a salute. Paul Heaney, CBC News, Vancouver.
The Noon News Hour with Doriana Temelo.
Good afternoon. It's been a day of environmental protest around the world. The Greenpeace organization was involved in 2 of those protests. In Vancouver, it harassed a U.S. Navy ship, and in England, it succeeded in turning back a Soviet ship laden with Canadian PCBs. And in a first for the Soviet Union, protesters marched on a huge nuclear installation in that country. Our first report comes from Vancouver. It wasn't quite a battle on the high seas, but a confrontation between Greenpeace and the U.S. Navy has resulted in 6 arrests. Greenpeace demonstrators surrounded the aircraft carrier USS Independence as it entered English Bay. Greenpeace says the vessel is carrying nuclear weapons. Efforts to hamper the American ship's arrival in Vancouver started well before sunrise.
In the quiet of the early morning, as most of the city still sleeps, Greenpeace prepares for war. With 4 Zodiacs, 2 boats and 20 protesters, it'll take on the American Navy.
This is, it's maybe a long path, but I believe that the people of New Zealand have managed to stop all nuclear weapons coming into their country, and I believe we can do the same in Canada, and this is part of that process.
The small armada charges out into English Bay, as in the distance an outline of the American warship USS Independence looms on the horizon. One of the ship's 6 Sea King helicopters hovers as a Zodiac taunts the 80,000-ton vessel as it lumbers through the water. Soon it drops anchor and police are ready for what's to come.
We want the other people of Vancouver to do whatever they can, whatever it might be, to stop these things coming in. It's just too disgusting to accept.
You have nuclear bombs on board. Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. Please turn around and leave our harbor right now.
The first tactic is to send a member up the vessel's anchor chain. Carrier crew members respond by pulling out the fire hoses. Arrests begin, first with the man on the anchor chain, then a member chained to a ladder on the stern of the ship, and 4 people in a Zodiac who have been spray painting the vessel.
100 nuclear warheads. All nuclear weapons are a threat to humanity, and we demand that these warheads be taken out of Canadian territory.
Greenpeace says their message is getting out. They'll keep up their protests, and more Canadians should join in.
I think the Americans have got the message because they're very secretive about their visits now. Sometimes they come in at night and they are no longer inform us when they're coming. They're aware that people of Vancouver don't want to see them here.
The Zodiacs circle the ship one last time and get yet another soaking from the crew and then head off. They say every time the federal government lets an American warship in, it's a slap on the face of Vancouver residents.
Blocked the anchoring of a U.S. aircraft carrier. The protesters sailed into English Bay to intercept the USS Independence. In rafts and small boats, they swarmed around the carrier, and when they painted the peace symbol on the hull, the Americans doused them with fire hoses. Greenpeace says it wanted to show that nuclear warships are not welcome here. The carrier is scheduled to stay in Vancouver until Sunday.
Demonstrators say the visiting American warship USS Independence carrying up to 100 nuclear warheads. And this morning, they took to the waters of English Bay in a new type of anti-nuclear protest.
They've come to express opposition to nuclear weapons. 30 people turn out for an early morning protest arranged by a swim coach who spends a lot of her time in these waters.
On Wednesday morning, early in the morning, I was with a group of swimmers swimming at Kitts Beach, and the ship was already here. It had just come in the night, and yeah, the sight of it is pretty upsetting.
No members actually took part, but Greenpeace ferries the protesters out to the USS Independence.
We ask you to leave our harbor right now. We're not against Americans. We're against the nuclear bombs that you bring into our harbor.
Instead of buzzing the vessel with Zodiacs, these protesters take to the water in a protest swim around the 1,000-foot-long ship. White peace balloons bobbing alongside of them.
Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. You have nuclear bombs on board. We ask you to leave our harbor right now.
In the orange cap is Vancouver Alderman Libby Davies. One sailor isn't amused.
You would help, my friend.
This kind of action, along with all the other actions that take place around the world, help change the attitudes of political leaders, and that's what we're trying to do. I mean, that's how disarmament has begun.
We've got to make them aware that this is not really the solution, anyhow, that people are going to protest things like this.
I want to live, and I want my kids to live.
It's not worth it.
It's a peaceful event, no police, no arrests. Within 20 minutes, it's back to shore.
Here you go, Tiki.
Oh, thank you. Can I have a big hug?
The Hollyburn shuttles crew members from ship to shore during the stay. Sailors say Vancouver stages the most energetic protest, but they don't mind.
The crew is looking forward, and is still looking forward for a real good liberty port like Vancouver. They all got a chuckle out of it. Everybody wanted to go up there and see them because it was something new, all right? And we were just having fun, too.
But as far as climbing up the anchor chains and things like that, that's just very unsafe. And we try to encourage people not to do that by spraying a little water down there and keeping them off.
On Sunday, the Independence heads home to San Diego.
Alderman Libby Davies has dried off since this morning's chilly swim to join us now in the studio.
Hi.
How was the swim?
Well, I really enjoyed it. It was a really unique experience, and it was really very special being with a bunch of people, swimmers, good swimmers, who got together really on one day's notice and decided that we were going to go in the ocean together and swim around the USS Independence.
You talked about it as a way to get the government going. You have to start somewhere. Do you really think things like this make any difference?
Yes, I do. I don't think that any one action in and of itself will do anything, but I think that sustained campaigns and public pressure over the long term really does bring about a very significant change. There's no doubt in my mind that if it hadn't have been for the huge peace movements around the world, we wouldn't now have disarmament agreements on land-based missiles. And the fact is that the whole issue of nuclear weapons on ships going across oceans and being in ports is really another major issue that needs to be dealt with, and it's going to take a lot of pressure and public protest from ordinary people.
Well, I know City Council has voted to declare Vancouver's port a nuclear weapons-free zone, but you can't do that without the government doing it, and the government doesn't appear to be doing that.
Well, I think that's the other major thing with this issue is that we're really dealing with our own federal government. The city of Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone, but our jurisdiction does not extend to the port. Now, most people would think of the port as part of the city, and of course it is, but legally it's under federal jurisdiction. So Vancouver City Council and lots of groups in the city of Vancouver have been urging the federal government to listen to the people of Vancouver who are simply saying, we're not opposed to Americans, we just don't want to see nuclear weapons on these vessels.
These ships come here, it's part of NATO, and we have commitments to NATO.
No, it's not. It's not part of any defense agreement. They are here for rest and relaxation. And even if it were
part of the NATO exercise in the sense that we have agreements with them for certain things, and if they come up here and say, like you say, rest and relaxation, how can we turn them away?
See, I don't personally have a problem with the American Navy coming to Vancouver, and I don't object to the sailors being in the city of Vancouver. The issue is the weapons that are on board. And I think it's really interesting that when the Soviets and the Americans agreed to visit each other's ports, if you remember, there were news stories about...
Bill McKnight says that's not true, though. You're telling me
they agreed to leave their weapons at home.
He says that's not been confirmed.
Well, I don't know, but that's what we heard, that agreement was being worked out. And I thought, well, that's incredible. When they visit each other's ports, they're willing to leave weapons at home.
What else would you plan for the USS Independence? Is this it?
For me, probably this is it. I'm going on a Greenpeace boat tonight. They're having an alternate reception because the USS Independence is holding a reception. But I do believe that there'll be still growing public concern and protest against the visits of nuclear-capable warships. And I've been very involved in that. And this was just sort of a personal thing I did today because I swim. And I thought, well, I can put my swimming to good use.
Thank you, Alderman Davies, for coming and talking to us today. The Emergency Department at St. Paul.
People entered the fray with a protest marathon swim aimed at forcing the Independence out of Vancouver Harbor. Deborah Goebel has the story.
USS Independence, please leave right now. You have nuclear bombs on board. Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. We're not against Americans, we're against nuclear weapons.
Those guys have got avgas and jet fuel and rocket fuel and high explosives and nuclear weapons on board that craft.
What made you do it?
Just concern, you know, that just let Ottawa know that there's certain people here.
The swimmers were protesting the nuclear weapons capabilities of the Independence while it visits Vancouver, a nuclear-free city. Alderman Libby Davies was one of the swimmers taking part.
How was it?
Well, it was really good being with a group of committed, great swimmers. It was the people against the weapons, the nuclear weapons. I had a good time.
It sure is different looking at it from the water up. It's a pretty scary looking thing.
Peace! Come on, they did it once.
The USS Independence is a Forrestal-class aircraft carrier with a complement of 44 aircraft and 6 Sea King helicopters. According to Greenpeace, the vessel stores nuclear bombs for use by the attack aircraft on board. It also holds nuclear depth charges for anti-submarine warfare. Aircraft carriers usually carry about 100 nuclear weapons. The City of Vancouver has passed a motion asking the federal government to declare the Port of Vancouver a nuclear-free zone. A group of Vancouver swimmers launched a peaceful protest against the presence of the USS Independence in English Bay. Greenpeacers were on hand, though they were not directly involved in organizing the demonstration. The swimmers were athletes, lifeguards, and concerned citizens.
I'll be back in a little while.
The swimmers met at Jericho Beach, where they were loaded onto boats provided by Greenpeace. The sun still hadn't come up as the group made its way toward English Bay. Greenpeace provided the transportation and the moral support. The tiny crafts were dwarfed by the ominous aircraft carrier, but the swimmers were undaunted.
Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. You have nuclear weapons on board. Please leave right now.
And the swim had begun. It wasn't a marathon, and it wasn't a race. It was a group of people out to make a point. They're upset at seeing a warship in Vancouver Harbor, and they're disappointed with Ottawa's failure to respond to Vancouver City Council's resolution to make the city a nuclear-free zone. Some of the crew members watched on, seemingly unimpressed by the effort. Among the swimmers was a local politician, Vancouver Alderman Libby Davies.
The presence of this huge carrier and all that it represents, its military might, the weapons that it is no doubt carrying on board, I think, you know, it's just a violation of the feeling that people in Vancouver have.
The entire flotilla circled the vessel one more time before heading home. The Independence, meantime, will be lifting anchor and powering up on Sunday. She'll head back to home base in San Diego.
The show is underway again in British Columbia, offering all kinds of flying machines, old and new. This is its 28th year, and there's a new twist. A high-tech trade fair is part of the event this time. Canadian wares are on exhibit, and that brought out the Prime Minister. Craig Oliver reports.
The U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds are accustomed to being the stars of international air shows. But this year in Abbotsford, they're fighting a losing PR battle with their Soviet adversaries. Who would ever have believed the latest Soviet frontline fighters, once shrouded in secrecy, would not only be on display, but up for sale? The first MiG-29 ever to visit North America is the star attraction here, as is the Russian transport, the AN-225, the biggest aircraft in the world. In the age of glasnost, Russia's top guns do their stuff for the cameras. And perestroika means Soviet salesmen are giving their wares the best sales pitch, just like capitalists.
Yes, we have the concrete, exact, precise proposals from the Canadian companies. Now, the stage of negotiation is there.
The Abbotsford Air Show, now in its 28th year, has become, organizers say, the biggest thing of its kind on the continent. 300,000 people will attend the three-day event this year. Kids love it. They can try out the cockpit of a B-1 bomber or sit in the pilot's seat of a deadly helicopter gunship. But Abbotsford is also becoming serious business. Prime Minister Mulroney is here because in the last year, a major aeronautical trade show has been added to it. High-tech equipment from around the world is on display. In opening the air show, Mulroney emphasized its importance to the aerospace industry.
This industry
is building challenging and stimulating jobs for our children in both English and French-speaking Canada. This is an industry that benefits all of Canada. The Prime Minister and his son Nicholas spent the day rubbernecking the flying circus from the stands, which included lots of U.S. warplanes. But during his BC trip, Mulroney chose to cancel a planned visit to the U.S. aircraft carrier Independence, visiting Vancouver Harbor. Members of the Vancouver City Council and of Greenpeace were protesting the visit of the nuclear carrier. Clearly, the Prime Minister's image makers didn't relish a run-in with them. Greg Oliver, CTV News, in Vancouver.
American aircraft carrier Independence was harassed by protesters tonight. Once again, a flotilla of small boats set out against the American Navy. Among them was NDP MP Sven Robinson.
I'm here because the government of Canada, our Conservative government, has refused to respect the will of the people of this community of Vancouver, who've said very clearly through our council that we don't want nuclear weapons in our port, we don't want nuclear weapons in our city.
The protest continued until later in the evening. Early this morning, another group of protesters launched a swim-in around the big ship. The group was made up of athletes, lifeguards, and concerned citizens. Clear protesters see the American carrier Independence as an ominous symbol of war and death. It's a different story for the sailors who man the ship. As Joni Marr reports, life on board the ship is very much like that of a crowded small town.
The fighter jets on the USS Independence will be idle while they're in Vancouver. But during a military exercise, 90 aircraft may be practicing from the ship's flight deck, which is the size of 3 football fields laid end to end. During their 12-hour shifts, sailors constantly monitor the $20 million machines they brought to show off in Vancouver.
Well, just kind of checking the integrity of the aircraft, make sure no one's messed with it, you know, and all the panels are secure. We don't have any leaks that might cause problems on the deck. Get fuel on the deck, we may have a fire, so we're constantly watching for that.
Since the 30-year-old aircraft carrier may be out of its home port of San Diego for 7 months a year, it has to be a virtual floating city. There's a bank on board to cash paychecks, a photo lab which produces everything from publicity pictures to ID cards. The ship's print shop puts out a newspaper, internal bulletins, and instruction sheets. There's an operating room, medical and dental clinic, laundry room with specific sailors detailed to that duty. The Independence even has its own police. Just like customs officials, they check visitors for banned items like weapons and drugs.
Yeah, the flight deck will work.
Dinner is served cafeteria style for 900 sailors at a time. There are few complaints about the food.
It ain't as good as Mom's cooking, but you know, it ain't as bad as hospital food neither. It never be like homemade. Close, but never like Mom's cooking.
You're listening to KAOS.
There's also a radio station hosted by sailors playing their requests. If it's reading you feel like, the ship's library has 10,000 books, tapes, and magazines.
It's very far in between that you find any privacy. You have to, well, like I said, the ship's library is a good place to come to, and not a lot of guys come down here, and or if you can go topside somewhere, find a moment by yourself.
If it's frustration that needs to be worked out, the ship has 2 weight rooms.
It helps eliminate some of the stress involved in day-to-day activities and working in an environment where people have to work close together, so it's important.
Sailors say life on the carrier is manageable if they think of the ship as a small town which travels from port to port and forget about how much they miss home. Joni Marr, CBC News, on the USS Independence.
In as many days, Vancouver Harbor was transformed into a mini battleground of sorts as a nuclear warship and a coalition of Greenpeacers went head-to-head. Yesterday, a small team of Greenpeace members spray-painted signs and even climbed aboard the USS Independence, a giant aircraft carrier. Well, today, another 30 people entered the fray with a protest marathon swim aimed at forcing the Independence out of Vancouver Harbor. Deborah Goebel has the story.
USS Independence, please leave right now. You have nuclear bombs on board. Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. We're not against Americans, we're against nuclear weapons.
Those guys have got gas and jet fuel and rocket fuel and high explosives and nuclear weapons on board that craft.
What made you do it?
Just concerned, you know, that just let Ottawa know that there's certain people here.
The swimmers were protesting the nuclear weapons capabilities of the Independence while it visits Vancouver, a nuclear-free city. Alderman Libby Davies was one of the swimmers taking part.
How was it?
Well, it was really good being with a group of committed, great swimmers. It was the people against the weapons, the nuclear weapons. I had a good time.
It sure is different looking at it from the water up. It's a pretty scary looking thing.
Peace! Come on, we did it once.
The USS Independence is a Forrestal-class aircraft carrier with a complement of 44 aircraft and 6 Sea King helicopters. According to Greenpeace, the vessel stores nuclear bombs for use by the attack aircraft on board. It also holds nuclear depth charges for anti-submarine warfare. Aircraft carriers usually carry about 100 nuclear weapons. The City of Vancouver has passed a motion asking the federal government to declare the Port of Vancouver a nuclear-free zone.
Protesters have not given up trying to turn away a visiting U.S. warship from English Bay. But today their tactics turned tame and symbolic. As the USS Independence sat idle in port, a group of about 30 people, including a city politician, gathered on shore. Like Greenpeace, they are opposed to nuclear-capable vessels in local waters. And so they dressed for a rather chilly dip in the salt chuck.
They've come to express opposition to nuclear weapons. 30 people turn out for an early morning protest arranged by a swim coach who spends a lot of her time in these waters.
On Wednesday morning, early in the morning, I was with a group of swimmers swimming at Kitts Beach, and the ship was already here. It had just come in the night, and yeah, the sight of it is pretty upsetting.
No members actually took part, but Greenpeace ferries the protesters out to the USS Independence.
We ask you to leave our harbor right now. We're not against Americans. We're against the nuclear bombs that you bring into our harbor.
Instead of buzzing the vessel with Zodiacs, these protesters take to the water in a protest swim around the 1,000-foot-long ship, white peace balloons bobbing alongside of them.
Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. You have nuclear bombs on board. We ask you to leave our harbor right now. Why don't you get your information straight,
In the orange cap is Vancouver Alderman Libby Davies. One sailor isn't amused.
See you in hell, my friend. Oh, you will fight. Think your country. Go to hell, my friend. See you in hell.
This kind of action, along with all the other actions that take place around the world, help change the attitudes of political leaders, and that's what we're trying to do. I mean, that's how disarmament has begun.
You've got to make them aware that this is not really the solution, anyhow. That people are going to protest things like this.
I want to live, and I want my kids to live.
Not worth it.
It's a peaceful event, no police, no arrests. Within 20 minutes, it's back to shore.
Here you go to eat.
Oh, thank you. Can I have a big hug?
The Hollyburn shuttles crew members from ship to shore during their stay here. The sailors say Vancouver stages the most energetic protests of any port they visit.
The crew is looking forward, and is still looking forward for a real good liberty port like Vancouver. they all got a chuckle out of it. Everybody wanted to go up there and see them because it was something new, all right? And we were just having fun, too.
As far as climbing up the anchor chains and things like that, that's just very unsafe. And we try to encourage people not to do that by spraying a little water down there and keeping them off.
When the Independence leaves on Sunday, no one will be certain that the protesters' claim of 100 nuclear warheads on board is true. That's classified information. So classified, even most of the crew don't know for sure.